This is a video on the modal ontological argument for the existence of God. To understand this, we'll have to do a quick crash course in modal logic. Modal logic involves propositions that are possible, impossible, necessary, and contingent. Possible propositions are ones that are logically possible. It doesn't necessarily mean if they're physically impossible. So if something is not logically impossible, then it is at least possible, even if it's not actually true. For example, the flying spaghetti monster exists, seems to be logically coherent, as far as I can tell, and so it is possibly true. Triangles have four sides is logically incoherent, and so it is impossible. Necessary propositions are propositions that must be true and cannot be false. Typical examples are mathematical and logical propositions. For instance, 2 plus 2 equals 4 is not only true, but it can't be false, and so it is necessarily true. Contingent propositions are propositions that could be true and could be false. Most propositions dealing with everyday physical objects and events are contingent. For example, Barack Obama as the President of the U.S. is true, but it could have been false, so it's contingently true. Similarly, Al Gore as the President of the U.S. is false, but it could have been true. It's contingently false. In modal logic, the concept of possible worlds is often used to express these types of claims. Possible worlds do not actually exist. They're just used to say, a way that reality could be, and the real world is one of the possible worlds. For example, saying that it is possible that the flying spaghetti monster exists is the same as saying the flying spaghetti monster exists in some possible world. Saying that it is impossible that triangles have four sides is the same as saying no possible world has triangles with four sides. Saying that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is necessary is like saying it is true in all possible worlds. There are no possible worlds where 2 plus 2 equals anything other than 4. Saying that it is contingent that Barack Obama is the President of the U.S. is like saying it is true in some possible worlds and false in others. Now to move on to the concept of God, we got to know what we're talking about here. Which God is it? This is an argument for the God of classical theism, who is the one generally thought of as omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, the creator of the universe, a necessary entity, although he isn't necessarily the God of any particular religion, although usually Judaism, Christianity, and Islam try to claim him as their own. We need to dig into this concept of a necessary entity a little bit. Examples of candidates for necessary entities would be numbers, logical truths, abstract objects, things that can't be false or cannot fail to exist. For example, the number 3 is a necessary entity. Nobody created it, it just exists necessarily. God is usually thought of as a necessary entity because he's the creator of all that exists, and he's usually thought of as the greatest conceivable being. If God were contingent, then that would imply that God has a creator, which is nonsensical. So asking who made God is like asking who is greater than the greatest conceivable being. Therefore, if God exists, he is necessary, like the number 3, and not contingent, like a person. So now we can move on to the actual argument as formulated by Alvin Plantinga, although this is my own simpler formulation of it. Premise number 1, it is possible that God exists. That is to say, the concept of God does not contain any logical absurdities, and so it is possible. Premise 2, if it is possible that God exists, then God exists in some possible world. That's from the concept of possible worlds that we learned about earlier in modal logic. Premise 3, if God exists in some possible world, then God exists in all possible worlds. Because if God exists, he's a necessary entity, and remember that necessary is synonymous with true in all possible worlds. Premise number 4, if God exists in all possible worlds, then God exists in the actual world. That's because the real world is one of the possible worlds. And the conclusion, therefore God exists. So is it convincing? Well, not really, and most theists would agree with that. It isn't really a convincing argument, but it's kind of hard to say why exactly. Because the logic does follow, and so the debate focuses primarily on the possibility premise. As a reminder, that is, premise 1, it is possible that God exists. That is to say, the concept of God does not contain any logical absurdities, and so it is possible. So, is God logically possible? The most recent attempt to show that God is logically impossible was the logical problem of evil, formulated by J.L. Mackie in the 1950s. And, however, it's generally agreed upon that Alvin Plantinga presented the free will defense in the 70s, and most philosophers, including Mackie, generally agree that it doesn't really carry any force anymore. Most philosophers don't use it, although it does have its defenders still, but it's fallen out of favor. But the evidential problem of evil lives on, so there's still plenty of arguments from evil out there. And remember, though, that the modal ontological argument, all it requires is logical possibility. So as long as it's logically possible, then it follows that God exists. So are there other logical absurdities in the concept of God? Well, perhaps. One of the more popular ones is the omnipotence paradox. Can an omnipotent being create a stone so heavy he can't lift it? If not, then there is something an omnipotent being can't do, which is absurd. However, omnipotence does not generally involve the ability to do the logically impossible, because asking, can an omnipotent being create a triangle with 4 sides, is like asking, can an omnipotent being Disney a purple, or can an omnipotent being Toad the Wet Sprocket. It's just gibberish. It's not actually referring to anything if it's a logical absurdity. You're just making words. So a stone so heavy an omnipotent being can't lift it is a logical absurdity, similar to a triangle with 4 sides. The modal ontological argument has certain implications for atheists. While it certainly isn't convincing, the argument does seem to prove that God is either logically impossible or logically necessary. In other words, the probability of his existing is either 0 or 1. Thus, it puts the burden on skeptics to try to show that premise number 1 fails. So atheists should set about looking for new arguments that show a logical absurdity in the idea of God. Implications for theists, since it involves a greatest conceivable being, it is one way of deriving the 3 main attributes of God: omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence. It's also a way of dealing with the problem of evil, because if God is either 0 or 1, the probability of his existing, then it doesn't matter how much evil is in the world, God must exist. And that is it for the modal ontological argument. Thank you for watching.